Tamara, welcome to the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to see you.
Thank you for letting me be here today.
And Richard here. I'm very excited to see this because I've been working with sort of this type of issue that we've talked about, this ADHD, various sort of mental states, as a parent over many years. And as I learn more and more, it's really exciting. And so I'm just wondering with you, what was sort of leading up to bring this book together? I know you worked with a lot of kids, you did a lot of things, you're a teacher at one stage. Could you tell us a bit about your background there and what brought this book out of you? Because it's a big effort to write a book.
Oh, well, thank you. The entire time when I was writing the book, my whole goal was to talk to those clients who I haven't met yet, who show up at my practice. They're so sad, they're overwhelmed, and they're full of self-loathing. And what wasn't written about, and what really, really pushed me to write this book, is we're not talking about the emotional side of ADHD. We're not talking about how really screwed up ADHD people feel like they are, not they are, right? And so I kept writing this, each chapter, just what would I want to tell someone who was hurting with ADHD? I'd want to tell them their brain's not broken, but there's a reason why you feel like you're losing your darn mind. And here's what it is.
Yeah, what's lovely about writing with the book is exactly as you say. You go through and you're piecing together a set of understandings, but also a set of understandings not about only what they're doing and feeling as ADHD, but these emotions. I mean, I love that or these difficulties you face: frustration, shame. This sort of difficulty with life. And I've seen that a lot too in my practice. So are these the things you need to manage first, or is there no sort of order of things? Tell us a little about the way you manage and work with someone who comes in the room.
This is loosely put. So if there's a neuroscientist listening, just kind of understand this is more metaphorical. But I like to start coaching from the back of the brain to the front. In other words, I don't start coaching executive functioning skills, because that's prefrontal cortex. And that's like asking me to lift a weight with my pinky. It's not the strongest muscle I have in my brain. So it's difficult for me. However, if I can start with the limbic system, that little amygdala that tells me fight or flight. And in those of us with ADHD, we get confused. What's a big deal? What's a small deal? We don't know. Maybe a bear's chasing us. And so I become confused. I'm, feeling a deadline coming up, and my body's responding like a bear is chasing me. And so with clients, I start by coaching this first. And I really work on first the fight or flight or freeze mechanism and helping them see what's actually happening to them. Then we work with emotional regulation. Then we start to work on cognitive control, the prefrontal cortex stuff.
This is what we want. We want people to have a perception and a utilization of the principles of neuroscience. This is the 21st century therapist. It's great.
Absolutely. So can we get into what is the inner landscape of the person with ADHD really like? So you touched on the emotional content. Can you paint us a picture there?
Yes. Well, it's a cacophony in my head. So I have ADHD. I've outed myself with this book, with opening the ADHD Center. I managed to hide in education, first in high school and then in higher ed. I just hid as a teacher and then professor. But after a while, I was noticing there were people like me who were hurting. So that's when I decided, well, I should step in and start to help people. First of all, a lot of us are hiders. In other words, we're just trying to fit in.
Right.
Recently, I met up with a friend from college. We hadn't connected over 30 years ago. And she and I met for coffee. It was wonderful. And she looked at me, she said, Tamara, I never knew you had ADHD. And I said, well, that's simple, Gina. I followed your cues. I remember looking over and going, well, she's using a yellow highlighter. I guess I'll do that too. And I
Right.
kept following the cues of what, air quotes, normal people would do. And so a lot of those of us with ADHD, we're not dumb, but the simple things are very difficult for us. And that's one of the themes in the book, right? So inside my head, the first processing I use is an emotional processor. And that's the number one thing we have to understand about all ADHD people. We may not like that about ourselves, but we process everything through an emotional processing first. I just want to remind you, the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex that would just say, just do it, is offline most of the time. Now, the times when I'm properly medicated, it's online, but as soon as the medication wears off, so does that strength. So because I don't have that just do it, my head goes through like a method actor going, what's my motivation? And then
Right.
I try to find a motivation to do this. And it's usually an emotional motivation.
So just coming back to the desire to fit in, obviously you're very conscious of being different, and just tell us a little bit more about that consciousness of being different. What are you aware of that is different?
So in my practice, I do work with people of all ages. And the thing that breaks my heart every time. Now, one of my specialties in my practice is working with ADHD people who have high IQs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's usually 125 and above. And what's heartbreaking is they know that they're out of step. And so let's say they have a high IQ, but their organizational skills, their social emotional regulation is very low and lower than what their peers would be. Mm-hmm. So now we have 3 levels where they're very low on the social emotional regulation. They're way behind their peers. And yet a lot of times they're smarter than their peers. Those are the kids that know they're behind. And so I see clients all the time going, it's like I'm in a marching band and I'm just a fraction of a step off. And that's how a lot of ADHD people feel. Okay. A lot of us feel socially inept, whether it's true or not.
Yeah. So what you're explaining sounds very much like the autism spectrum. So what is differentiating ADHD from autism?
This is why a lot of my clients have the high IQ folks have been identified on the spectrum.
Right.
And yet as I'm working with them, I'm like, no, this go back and get a second opinion on this. Again, the ADHD brain starts kind of in the limbic center with the fight, flight, or freeze. Mm-hmm. Now, remember, anyone with ADHD under the age of 26 is running 3 years behind developmentally. And that's a pretty consistent 3 years behind. So if I'm working with a 3rd grader, you know that they're not operating like a 3rd grader socially and emotionally. With ADHD, though, it is a very consistent developmental pattern, and that eventually ADHD people will grow into their brains. If you're on the spectrum, and I really hesitate to speak because I'm not an expert in this area, but from what I understand, there's a feeling of feeling out of step and not knowing what to do with it. It's like there's a big gap there. For my clients, they can see that they're out of step, but they're not really that far out of step. It's a little bit more exaggerated in their brain than with someone on the spectrum.
Yeah,
is that making sense?
No, that's really good. I'm just sort of jumping in with some of the background on it. There's a bit more in the spectrum. is more things that or not so much don't work, but things that aren't working. There are connections that aren't there, and
Yes.
these are to do and affect things like social engagement and reading cues and so on and so forth. And with ADHD, there tends to be all the stuff is there, but under certain pressures, things shut down. And so that's quite a different thing. What do you think about that thought, Tamara?
I think that's part of it. There's also this. So my ADHD clients have the perception of being out of step, and then followed by the 3-year lag. And it's because they have it. It's just developing at a slower pace than their peers, but they do have it. And it's the reason it's ADHD is it's the prefrontal cortex issue, right? It takes time to grow into that prefrontal cortex.
And there are so many cultures, particularly indigenous cultures, where timing of education, age natures of education aren't so fixed. Whereas, Sir Ken Robinson said, we're unfortunately, we educate based on date of manufacture.
Yes.
And I know in our Aboriginal communities in Australia, you just learn what you learn when you learn it, and that's great. Nobody worries whether there's an 8-year-old with a 12-year-old or
Right.
but our culture tends to say you need to be a specific thing at a specific time. And as you're just saying, that this, I call it a brainscape. Like people talk about mindsets. I say we all have different brainscapes that, and architecture is another term that we use. So this idea of being behind, but it's talking about being behind something that somebody else decided was the thing that it was supposed to be.
Right.
And yet you had this issue, became a teacher, professor. So over time, it's not an issue. How do people deal with that contention, particularly when they're younger? Like, hey, you're 14. I'm sorry, you're a few years behind, but don't worry, you'll catch up. What does that feel like? How do you work with that?
So, yeah, I love that you bring this up. So I think of education in the industrial age. In other words, we plop kids on the assembly line, send them down the line, right? And so you add the parts at different times. And it is difficult for my kids, because the kids, meaning the clients I see, because they do expect, and teachers will say, you're a 5th grader now, you don't get recess. Well, my little guy is showing up and he's still has the developmental skills socially and emotionally, and not always socially, right? There are some ADHD people with who are very socially adept, right? But let me be clear, executive function, always 3 years behind, because that's almost the definition of ADHD, right?
Yeah.
So those kids, they get the message that they're just failing. And so here's what's interesting about ADHD people can look like the dumbest people on earth. We can't get out of the house on time. We forget dumb things. Being grown-upping is so irritating to us. And yet sometimes we can look like geniuses because we're really good at divergent thinking.
Yeah.
And so all the time people are carrying this of, how can I be so smart here and so dumb here? I just had a client, he's being sent to Alaska to work with some of his clients, and he told his travel agent the wrong city. So he has tickets to the wrong city in Alaska because it was just one of those ADHD glitches.
Right. Yeah.
And he said, how can I be so stupid? I'm like, and yet he's so smart and he can do this incredible job that he does.
So let's just talk about that divergent versus convergent thinking for a minute.
Convergent thinking is what Sherlock Holmes does, right? It's deductive, it's sequential. It's hold up, let's stop and put the pieces together. That is prefrontal cortex activity.
Right. Yeah.
Which is insanely boring if you have ADHD. Okay. Every ADHD person I know really tries to avoid convergent thinking to a fault. However, the ADHD brain naturally goes towards this thing we call divergent thinking. And divergent thinking takes one idea and blows it up in 50 million pieces, and then sees all the connections between all the pieces. This is why we drive our teachers nuts, because we're like, wait, why are we learning this? Wait, is this connected to this? Well, why would this? And so I have I used to teach educational psychology in a different life when I was a professor. And in one of my classes, I would hand everyone, in this case, pink marshmallows, because I thought they were pretty. All these little miniature pink marshmallows. I would hand them to each student, and I'd say, these represent facts.
Mm-hmm.
And some of your students want to line up the facts. So here are toothpicks, and line up the facts. And so they would connect the little toothpicks together. And that was kind of scaffolding and putting schema together. I said, but then you do have these divergent thinkers. And I gave them more toothpicks and more marshmallows. And I said, now make the biggest structure you can out of marshmallows and toothpicks. And these are your divergent thinkers.
Right. Yeah.
And so students would have, and then some of my sassy students would combine their schemas and get really huge schemas. But that's what ADHD people do. We love creating these big structures in our head, and we focus on the toothpicks. We don't focus on the marshmallows. They're not as interesting as the toothpicks are.
Right.
That's
right.
so interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's also some interesting things that come through in the nature of the way people deal with the frustrations that occur, but in ADHD people. But one of the most fascinating comments was a radio talkback program years ago. I was listening, and this father rang up and he said, "Oh, my son, I took him to the doctor. He was behaving really weird, and he'd get out of control. And my doctor told him he had attention deficit something. So I paid more attention to him, and he's much better." and so that I just took from that what we do is we get these kids that they behave divergently, unusually, difficultly, unexpectedly, and so we put them at arm's length. And so there's also this sort of, well, I don't know whether it'd come into attachment theories or things like that, but there's sort of this disconnect from other people.
Yeah. So many of my clients just want to be seen, and they want to be heard.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, and that's the beauty of coaching, frankly, is I go where the client is and start there and ask, how do I move forward? And one of the differences between coaching and therapy would be, therapy asks, how did you get here? And coaching says, I don't care how you got here. How are you going to move forward? And both are necessary at different times, right? But so many people show up in my office and go, I'm just overwhelmed and no one gets me. And I feel like everyone is irritated with my endless questions of, why would we do this? That's a toothpick question, right? Why would we do it like this? And so they're very frustrated and ostracized because they're not simple yes people. Yes, I'll do that. Right. And so you do see this interesting kind of separateness forming. And maybe that's part of the separateness that ADHD folks feel that we were talking about at the beginning of this.
I just want to come back to the attention in ADHD. It sounds to me from what you've been saying that the attention part should really be labeled divergent thinking. Like it's not an attention deficit, it's a divergent amplification. Would that be right?
Or, yeah.
It's too much attention disease is what I would call it. In other words, we're paying too much attention. Normally our prefrontal cortex will kind of weed out and screen for things to ignore and not see.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And even into adulthood, ADHD people are looking at the whole constellation, looking at everything.
Not enough
and
filtering.
Not filtering at all.
Yeah.
And because I imagine then, and I'm just taking this from my own experience with my family, that having something that gives you a really good reason to focus. And our boy is fantastic. He's a restoration plasterer. So he restores. So there'll be a broken ceiling mold, or there'll be some historic sort of thing, and he will sit there and he will just attend to that, and he will work it and do it until the lights have gone off, but he's still there. But what used to happen when he was a kid is at the big department store, when his mother was taking him down into the food hall for something to eat, by the time the escalator got down to the bottom, he was on the ground asleep. All that overwhelm turned off his prefrontal cortex. But if he gets the focus, he really loves it.
Well, and Tom Brown writes about ADHD folks as having a interest-centered nervous system. In other words, whatever will interest me emotionally gets my attention the most.
Right.
And so your son has found something that is his passion, and he can spend hours doing it because there's great emotion behind it. Sense of pride, completeness, mission, whatever it is, it's compelling him to keep doing it. And that's why he can sustain this work. It's interesting because most of my clients will say, I'm not creative.
Oh.
But we may not all be painters, songwriters, actors, but we do lean on the divergent thinking. And that's so if you ever want to kind of capture your clients, you can invite them into a metaphor and have them play with a metaphor. It's a trick that we can use when ADHD people speak metaphor, and we speak it fluently, right? Because metaphor is language and it's pictures, and it's not really semantic. It's not prefrontal cortex activity as greatly, right? And so whenever you can entice your clients, entice them emotionally through that emotional lane of memory.
That's so interesting, because in my early days I was an actor in my early days, and then I did a linguistics degree because I talked a lot and I thought that might be interesting. And then I did the neuroscience and things, and I can't remember who said it, but they said the metaphor is a way in which the frontal areas of the brain, the front part and the rear part, the sensorial part, can talk to each other, or at least communicate with each other. So there's this, wow, ADHD, using metaphors, finding a way to create a communication pathway, even when the prefrontal cortex is sort of shutting down because it's overwhelmed. This is pretty clever stuff, clever, intuitive sort of stuff. What are they, what's going on?
So in my book, I actually ask my clients, or ask the readers, to imagine their metaphor of their ADHD. And the reason I use that, I have them come up with it. It usually takes 2 or 3 sessions. They're like, oh, I don't know. And that's fine. Just keep thinking about it. Think on it. And then they'll come back and say, I got it. I got my metaphor. And once they get a metaphor, and we know this from behavioral research, once they get a metaphor, now we know how to solve their problem, their ADHD problem.
That's so clever.
Right?
Wow.
So I'll give you a quick example if we have time, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Please, no, please do. This is great. I'm loving this.
My metaphor, I'll just pick on myself. My metaphor was I had to run a 3-legged race every day with a person identical to me, but missing a prefrontal cortex. And I'll be darned if she didn't sit down halfway through the race and just start to pick dandelions.
That's Pete at the bottom of the stairs. Yeah.
Right. And so I'm going to confess something here. It's a bit dark. I don't want to scare any of your listeners, but the way I got through my dissertation unmedicated was I metaphorically knocked her unconscious and dragged her body across the line. Okay, I
Right.
know. I can hear. I can hear someone gasp, going, "Oh, that's self-loathing." Yes, it is.
Yes, we put her quietly to sleep, and then
Yeah.
gave her an
I knocked
ambulatory
her.
assistance.
I knocked that wench out. She was wasting my time, and you hear my personality kind of overriding my ADHD.
But isn't
Now,
it
that is
interesting?
not a healthy thing to do, right? And so when I solve my ADHD problem, I have to start with, yeah, we got to learn how to run a three-legged race with someone and not be mad at her all the time. So let's start to show her some forgiveness. Can we have grace? And maybe she points out dandelions that are actually interesting sometime. So that's how we're going to resolve that ADHD metaphor.
I have a feeling maybe I am a bit ADHD. I'm not sure, but I certainly am divergent in my thinking. People are always saying, "Richard, what the hell are you talking about?" But these sorts of metaphors, these sorts of carry-ons. Actually, I'm just remembering back to when I was in school. I used to do the jumping events, the high jump, the long jump, and all that sort of things. And someone said, "Oh, he's a jumper." And I said, "No, I'm a woolly jumper." And so I used to feel warm. Jumping made me feel warm. And I think a lot of people might think that they might find, if they think about it, that they use metaphors for themselves in their lives, and then they improve them and develop them. But what we're saying here beautifully with ADHD is that's a way that you can create a connection and an engagement with the frontal activity and the rear activity, and develop through the metaphor, not just coincidentally develop them. And that's wonderful. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah,
I'll shut up now. Back
just
to you,
on
Matt. But
just
gee
on,
whiz, that's great.
on
I
that.
love
I'm
it.
just thinking. So the metaphor. So you're creating a point of reference and an anchor or something. And actually, what I'm thinking out loud here. You're creating some convergent thinking to then use as a platform to solve some problems.
And a consistency.
It's a very sneaky way into the convergence, though, because you really always want to kind of trick me into thinking convergently, right? So I'd rather say, right, convergent thinking is like putting your foot on the brake, and divergent thinking is like putting your foot on the gas.
Yeah.
And those of us with ADHD have a need for speed. And
Right.
so if you can trick me into it by going, "Well, Tamara, here's what I just heard you say." Like, "Oh, that was a little bit convergent, wasn't that?"
Yeah,
then,
You've given yourself a home screen to come back to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. Oh, I like that. Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Cool. We're being creative. There's another metaphor. Beautiful.
Yeah. So what other tips do we have? We're talking to therapists working with kids or adults with ADHD. What other things would you like to say to therapists to do in the therapy room?
Yeah. One of the things that works quite well. So remember, we talked about emotions and ADHD. A lot of my clients really enter into coaching with a lot of self-loathing. By the way, we have a lot of therapists in our ADHD center too. And so in our center, like, well, you could kind of go, "Oh, you have incredible self-loathing that surpasses coaching right now. How about you go see this therapist?" And then the therapist is like, "Oh, it's time for you to work on some skills. Go see a coach." And so we do a lot of that.
Yep.
But something that crosses both coaching and therapy is we start to do some parts work. So I can tell you what my parts work looks like in coaching. Therapists have slightly different training, but I help the client understand what's the ADHD version of themselves and what's the non-ADHD version. And we start to get people at the table talking. And so I usually this has started already in therapy. But usually if we can get people talking. So one of my clients, she figured out she has two different versions of her ADHD self. One is a frightened, overwhelmed little girl who is just shaking all the time. And the other one she described him as a caveman, and who is always like not that smart, but willing just to beat something up to get the job done. And she
Okay.
couldn't figure out, how do I have these two different ADHD characters in my head? I just said, it doesn't matter. They're there. So let's start working with them.
Yeah.
And so let's start talking to that little girl, make sure she's safe. And it's the ADHD, anxiety, overwhelmed kind of feelings, right? And let's work with caveman who's just like, screw this. And
Yeah.
he's a
Yeah.
very angry man from what I picked up.
Oh,
But then to get her to negotiate with them.
yeah. So again, creating some great points of reference that are
Right.
very, very anchoring. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I had one of the clients I was working with. She spontaneously did it, but she named them. I didn't specifically go to parts because I have other methods of working to where I try to see what they'll come up with, and give a bit more time. And she suddenly just came and said, "Oh, such and such a name, that's the one that does such and such and such and such." And that was, and it was so cooperatively with the therapist, this would have been excellent. I mean, I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't read your book. I didn't know. She just did it, and I took advantage of it, and I went with it. But
Right.
so that's pretty much the same sort of story. And she's now got about 3 or 4 different characters that and some she likes using, and some when they turn up she tells them to go away, which is a bit like your other person on the other side of the 3-legged race. So this is this is something that's very natural for people, because it's not
Right.
just the therapist that has to do it. So that's
Well,
great.
and remember, we create stories in our head. ADHD people, we're tied to metaphors, we're tied to stories. That DMN network, it just kind of, we love that part of our brain, right? So if we can get our clients kind of thinking about their own stories in their head. So when someone shows up, I teach the person to go, not to shoo them away, go away, anxious Amy, I don't want to hear from you. We say, oh, anxious Amy, why are you here? What are you trying to tell me right now? And how can I care for you? So we're not angry at separate parts. We're accepting those parts and we're loving those parts. We're just not letting them drive the bus. If I could just mix all kind of metaphors here, we're not putting them in charge of things.
Yeah. Or there might be something truly adaptive or important in the moment for that part, which we might not be aware of.
Yeah.
Right.
This has given me some wonderful clues for I'm going to talk more about some of these elements in this way. This is great. Thank you so much.
Can I just tell you, for those of your listeners who work with children, this works well with children. It's a little bit of a different activity, but I have little monkeys in my office with name tags, and they choose the name tags that apply to the monkeys in their head. So there is anxious Amy, overwhelmed Oscar, all these guys. And then we act out like how they talk in their head. And I had a little guy in my office, about 7 years old, and he had so much anxiety. And he was one of those high IQ little men, so smart, but was really anxious about everything. And I said to him, so he had anxious Andrew. And I said, so anxious Andrew's there. What should we do with anxious Andrew? And a lot of boys will throw anxious Andrew up in the air, pretend to shoot him with a machine gun, US guns, all that. No, not this little guy. This little guy picks up, he goes, oh, Andrew, I'm so sorry you're feeling so anxious. Let me give you a hug. And he started to take care of anxious Andy.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's
and
beautiful.
of course, mom started crying. And since I'm a sympathetic crier, I got teary-eyed. But he was starting to learn compassion. And that's really what we're trying to do with our older clients too.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Now, looking at yourself as your own case study, what can you tell us about the developmental trajectory of ADHD, having, lived, I don't know, what have you're probably about 30 by
25.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely 29.
Yeah, okay,
We're going to
okay,
go with that
yeah.
one.
All right, yeah.
I've lived more than half a century. So here's what happens. The ADHD brain, I was just thinking about this today on how ill adapted I was for the modern world. Okay. Up
Right.
until around 26 for females, 28 for males, ADHD people are just ill adapted for the modern world. And it takes us that long to kind of grow into our brains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know this, neurotypicals grow into their brains probably about 3 years before, right?
Yeah, that's sort of
Right.
mid-20s type thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mid-20s. And you add 3 years for us, that's when we'll probably do it. So after that, the ADHD symptoms are still there, but now I have this more complex understanding about how the modern world works.
Right.
And so that's when I get deep into my emotional motivation of, well, Tamara, a grown-up would be doing this right now. Tamara. And so the shame starts to kind of whittle away, right? Or as I confessed earlier, my metaphor was about self-loathing,
Yeah.
right? So that's where I try to motivate myself emotionally to get things done. So that follows us all through our lives.
Right. So there's just a more acute self-awareness in the social context that you're in, and you use shame, it sounds like, as a lever to try and change.
Well,
Yeah,
yes,
there's 5 bad emotional motivational tricks that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And anxiety is actually one of them. We'll kind of rev things up to motivate
Right.
ourselves. Anger, shame, self-loathing. There's procrastination's another emotional trick.
Mm-hmm.
Avoidance. The 6th one is avoidance. That's harder to explain, but those are kind of emotional tricks we use to try to start that emotional engine to give us, why should I do this? I'm angry. That's why. And so I worked with a client 2 weeks ago who cleaned his garage because he was angry at his wife, and cleaned his garage out of spite.
Yeah. So they are
On him,
incredibly,
it's still clean.
right. They're incredibly important internal realities for therapists to be aware of what's going on. Yeah.
Yes, and to use those emotional responses, utilize the emotional responses that may be negative in some circumstances, but turn them into an energetic, positive framework.
Well, here's the problem with that. They're exhausting. And
Right.
so if you have an emotional brain, that just takes a lot of energy. We have to constantly shift, and we're not automatics, right? We're not an automatic engine. We have to manually shift our brain a lot, and that's exhausting when we have ADHD. So with my clients, I help them understand, here's where you're going to want to start. You're going to want to start at your emotional motivation, like that method actor I mentioned before. But is there a possibility we could engage our imagination and do it a different way? And so do I have to get angry to clean the garage? And people will look and say, I think so.
Right.
Well,
okay, that's a bit hard, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But let me understand, and let me help you understand there's a cost to that for you. Now, I'm begging for all your listeners who don't have ADHD to understand the just do it button is broken. So when a lot of really helpful people want to help us, they say, well, just make a list. To which we're like, no kidding, make a list. Okay. That doesn't get it done for us. We still have to get the emotional task initiation. And so, the just do it button is broken. It is amazing that any people with ADHD get anything done during the day. And I'm really serious about this, guys. If you followed me around, you'd be like, how is she even a grown up? So, and I'm a relatively high functioning ADHD person.
Yeah.
So, you know, just this all takes so much more energy. And some days we can pull it off and look, you know, close to neurotypical. Other days you're like, seriously.
That's so
Okay.
much. Ellen DeGeneres does a wonderful comedy sketch on this sort of around the procrastination, but it's the ADHD, and she's looking for something, and she ends up down in the basement, and then she's finding them there. Well, these CDs are nice, and that wall, it really needs painting. And you know, it's just this beautiful stuff. And the wonderful thing about the sketch is by the time you get to the end, you've forgotten what she went down there for. But what I just feel so much in my own life, because I have a very disparate way of thinking as well, is just, why do I have to behave? Why is there this behavior pattern of, why not find the CD and paint the wall? And of course, we know that because culture and society has built up certain needs and wants, and you know, you have to go to work and satisfy certain needs and wants. And I just am hearing that the first thing the ADHD person has to say to herself, and this is what we worked at, you know, with our children, was you are not bad, you are not wrong. You are having, you know, the world is as wrong as you are wrong, but let's try and make two wrongs and make it a right.
Right. You know, it's finding an ADHD friendly way to adapt to our modern world. I will never look neurotypical, but I can make it in a modern world. So remember, ADHD is highly dependent on environment. So I have two surgeons who happen to be married, and one surgeon, who is the male, found out he had ADHD. He's been practicing surgery for 15 years. He gets his diagnosis. He walks into his team and says, all right, guys, listen, I just found out I have ADHD. You guys need to step it up. His wife, on the other hand, his wife, on the other hand, says she's known that she's had ADHD for years. She's deep undercover. Right. She will never tell anyone. Why? Two different environments, even for they're both surgeons. Right. But as a female, she's not allowed to have those things. And women tend to take all of their ADHD and kind of put it inside with shame, self-loathing. Men tend to spill it outward in anger and go, you know, you guys need to step up. Yeah. And so it's about environment.
Yeah, context.
So a lot of times with my clients, they're in the wrong environments, right? Accountants are the ADHD accountants. They're some of the saddest people I know, until they find the right accounting firm and get into the right work. Yeah.
Wow. Context and social context, so important.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of really great elements here, haven't we, Matt?
Absolutely. So just a reminder to everybody, we're talking about Your Brain's Not Broken, Strategies for Navigating Your Emotions and Life with ADHD, with Tamara here. And Tamara, as we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to sort of leave our listeners with?
Well, I said it before, but I'm going to say it again. Please don't ask us to just do this. Walk with us. Yeah. And by the way, don't even ask us why, because let me tell you, our whys are going to get very convoluted very fast. So if someone says, why haven't you done that, Tamara? Well, let me tell you, I can tell you so many reasons why, but that's not going to get me closer to actually doing the task. Right. So walk with us, see us, understand that it's a loud conversation in our head all the time. Medication does help that, folks, and properly medicated people do find their just do it button. eventually.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Tamara Rosier, thank you so much for this wonderful insight. Merely scratching the surface, I know, but we really recommend people go out and get your book and get in and engage and understand. And if you're dealing with ADHD kids, we'll have links in the show notes for the book, but also to your center. And we just wish you all the well and stay well and healthy and live a long time, because you're doing great work.
Oh, thanks. I think you guys are really great too. Thank you for your work.
Thank
This
you.
is good.
Thank you so much. All right. We'll catch you another time then.
All right. Thank you.
Bye for now.